I want to just say a bit about Adam Curtis's Bitter Lake, released in 2015. I would just like to open with a quote from Adam Curtis. This is from a 2015 interview, the promotion for Bitter Lake. And he says, all reality is incredibly complex and chaotic. To make sense of it, we have to tell stories about it, which inevitably simplifies. And that is what politicians and journalists do. What I try to do is to find new facts and data, things you haven't thought about, and turn them into new stories. My aim is to use those stories to try and make the complexity and chaos intelligible. So, documentary filmmaker and journalist Adam Curtis has been hailed as one of the most important contemporary political filmmakers of our time. Film scholars often mention Curtis alongside figures like Michael Moore and Errol Morris as filmmakers engaged with political topics and subject matter while addressing mainstream audiences. But his image practice is also sometimes considered to be of a piece with the more formally and politically radical work of figures like Emile D'Antonio, Jean-Luc Godard, and Harun Farokhi in the still debated form of what is called the essay film. His work can also perhaps be thought about alongside collage film artists like Craig Baldwin. Furthermore, Curtis has also been embraced by the art world, showing his work in single and multi-channel installations in galleries and collaborating with art rock bands like Massive Attack in large-scale synesthetic art parties. Assembled from highly suggestive juxtapositions of images drawn from the BBC archives in conjunction with audioscapes constructed from appropriated popular songs and film soundtracks, interviews with experts, and voiceover exposition, Curtis's montage and collage based films perform a kind of media specific analysis of how political machination and technological development mutually determine our current socio political world and the narrow ways that we imagine it. For his part, Curtis has described himself as a journalist, influenced by the modernist novels of John Dos Passos, as well as popular music, all with the desire to tell stories that make, as we said, the complexity and chaos of our mediatized and globalized world intelligible. Now, in an article from his BBC blog that is no longer maintained, entitled The Medium is the Message, Curtis summarizes the complex plot of Bitter Lake thus. Quote, in 1929, the king of Saudi Arabia machine-gunned many of the Wahhabist radicals in the bleak sand dunes of Arabia because they wanted to go on and create a caliphate across the Islamic world. Ever since then, the Saudi royal family have tried to deal with this unstable force by exporting it beyond their borders. Bitter Lake shows how, when the Russians invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Saudis encouraged its young radicals to go and fight. They brought Wahhabist ideas with them to the camps in the mountains. To begin with, those ideas lay dormant, but when Afghanistan collapsed into chaos in the 1990s, Wahhabism became more and more influential. It powerfully influenced Osama bin Laden's thinking, and then spread further through the chaos of Iraq after 2003. As it did so, it reverted to the dream of creating a caliphate based on an imagined vision of the past. Out of this has come ISIS and the horrors in northern Syria. And ISIS, with its stark simplification of the world into black and white, is just the enemy that fits with the Western political vision. The jihadists and our leaders are locked together into a bubble that divides the world into goodies and baddies. Now, that's Adam Curtis describing his film. Now, I'm not going to focus here on the merits or deficits of the specific arguments Curtis puts forward in the film about the failed American and Russian projects of so-called modernizing Afghanistan and the rise of militant Islamic fundamentalism. I will only add here the important point that the film takes the inspiration for its title in part from a historic 1945 meeting held between King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the Suez Canal. This meeting was part of the United States' interest in modernizing Afghanistan through the development of massive dams and management of water systems, notably in the country's Helmand province. In 1946, the American Morrison-Knudsen Corporation began construction of the dams. So rather than analyze the substance of Curtis's argument, though, I am interested in how Bitter Lake situates the history of the West's, and notably America's, imperial interest in Afghanistan firmly within the broader context and analysis of capitalism and its media systems. So here we will consider a couple of the ways Curtis deploys images from the BBC archive of who employ Adam Curtis. He is employed by the BBC and has basically free access to its massive archive of images as an intervention into the West's historical memory as well as its contemporary imagination. In Bitter Lake, then, Curtis not only reimagines extant images from official news reports, documentaries, commercials, and films from the BBC archives to build a meta-narrative. Rather, when the obvious signs of remix and resignification are factored into the reception of his film, a certain awareness of the official images as a functional part of the War on Terror and the West's project of instituting capitalist democracy in Afghanistan emerges. So, indeed, one could argue that Curtis approaches the archive as a vast repository of institutionally sanctioned found footage, for, as mentioned above, he not only reuses official images and sequences, but puts to cinematic use what can variously be called the outtakes, the ends, the handles, the setups, and the like, that never appeared for public consumption, but nevertheless inform both the production and circulation of the news in its construction of images of the past and present of Afghanistan in this case. In Bitter Lake, Curtis does not explicitly signpost which shots were previously used and which remained unused by the BBC, but the effective power of duration in certain of these takes and long takes, things involving reframing, long pauses, and pregnant uneventfulness, or the sustained or emergent melancholy or pain manifest in shots that linger after a traumatic event, such as an explosion or shooting, alert one, the viewer, to how images are mobilized as detachable and modulated, effective pieces in the bid for viewer attention. In these and other ways, Curtis confronts the televisual apparatus, or what Marianne Doane has termed a catastrophe machine, that, quote, seeks both to preserve and to annihilate indeterminacy and discontinuity, unquote, by reappropriating its signifying problematic in order not to simply produce the ideological effect of access to some transcendental real, but to create emblems or metaphors that link to a self-consciously and explicitly narrativized engagement with history. This is where Curtis is editorializing as a journalist. And as is obvious, Curtis's voiceover quite often manages or sets into play the potentially unwieldy meanings of the discrete fragments that, while often presenting opportunities for narrative emplotment, also resist it. So therefore, filmic, electronic, and digital images not only form the substance of Curtis's montage, or his economy of attention, but also betray how he is at base a narrative documentary filmmaker, or better, in his words, a journalist struggling with a database, a nonlinear system of images and references and documents, systems ostensibly capable of various and perhaps limitless combinations to fashion his own politically meaningful statement charged by the image's potential to mean different things. So on these terms, the media critic John Doyle, in his essay Adam Curtis as Remixologist, The Case for Metajournalism as Radical Practice, has written, quote, has written of various of the sequences, very complex sequences in Bitter Lake, and he in draws our attention in particular to a sequence at about halfway through the middle of the film, and he sets it up by providing us with some further context as to where this footage comes from. So here's Doyle, quote, "The third source of visual material that is sampled in Bitter Lake is footage that was collected, collated, and filmed by the BBC cameraman Phil Goodwin. This footage of Afghan citizens, news cameramen, and British and US soldiers provides more abstract and emotive footage. This type of footage is often not included in the BBC news narratives of Afghanistan, which tend to use images that are selected to conform to the requirements of continuity editing and then structured into simplistic sequences." Right, so Curtis is, according to Doyle here, is taking images and fragments of images, but also the footage that is not used by the BBC, and the way that he is both the footage he is using and the way he is bringing it together, constructing it, editing it together, is in defiance of the traditional modalities of continuity editing, of seamlessness that the BBC and other nightly news organizations use this, the ways that they use this footage. And so Doyle goes on, quote, in describing this, particular sequence that we'll watch in a moment that falls roughly in the middle of the film, and how it functions. Here is Doyle. Quote, one extraordinary sequence both demonstrates how Curtis's editing has pushed this technique towards the remix and also makes full use of this type of visual material, the visual material just mentioned. This complex sequence mixes 53 images in a 3-minute sequence with a modern trance music soundtrack. This sequence resembles a trailer, but is placed at the midpoint of the film. The sequence cuts between images of dust clouds, a U.S. attack helicopter, injured cameramen, dancing women, birds, politicians, explosions, banks, cityscapes, and terrorists, which rewind and remix while a graphic sequence is intercut between the images. Here is the sequence. At Bitter Lake's sci-fi infused conclusion, Adam Curtis describes how the narratives and models of meaning produced by our governments and media systems no longer hold any real or convincing explanatory power or imaginative conviction. As a result, the people of Western democracies are increasingly caught within a solipsistic feedback loop in an increasingly alien world. In a provocative metaphorical appropriation of the haunting conclusion of Andrei Tarkovsky's 1972 science fiction film Solaris, Curtis allegorically summarizes Bitter Lake's central thesis. Quote, the experience of Afghanistan has made us begin to realize that there is something else out there, but we just don't have the apparatus to see it. This sequence, near the end of Bitter Lake, might be seen then as gesturing toward what Curtis has described elsewhere as, quote, a new kind of journalism that is going to come from something that is actually a work of giant imagination. So if you're intrigued by Curtis, I will mention that he has a new 6-film series as part emerging like Bitter Lake, made for multi-platform digital distribution, and it will be streaming first for the BBC iPlayer, opening on February 11th of this year, 2021. So this new six-part film series is entitled "Can't Get You Out of My Head: An Emotional History of the Modern World." And he says in one of the taglines for this new series, "These strange days did not just happen. We and those in power created them together." I think that's a fitting place to conclude our week on found footage. This notion of something strange, something emerging, created by both ourselves and those in power being co-created, right? So images being made by one party, one system of power with one set of meanings, and then those images traveling and circulating, being appropriated, being mashed together into new configurations, in a sense also implicating us in a sense, this sort of larger economy of images and meanings, and in Curtis's terms, chaos. And this, of course, includes Adam Curtis himself. Okay, so finally, let's turn very quickly to our questions and discussion, so that we can take up either in Microsoft Teams chat on Friday or online in our Canvas discussion. So my first question is, how is meaning generated in documentary films that deploy found footage? What is the role of context and intention in the found footage documentary, broadly speaking? Perhaps you can identify some examples from films that you have seen. In your discussion, it might be useful to pay attention to questions of intentionality and temporal disparity. How does the film in question that you are discussing produce what Jamie Barron calls the archive effect? Second, with Vivian Sobchak's discussion of the phenomenology of non-fictional film experience in mind, consider some of the different ways we can view the footage in both Videograms of Revolution, as well as shooting and storming of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., or perhaps also Bitter Lake. Can we think of these films, or aspects, or parts of them, in terms of the home movie, or perhaps the traditional documentary, or perhaps even the fiction film, perhaps all three? Third, in Bitter Lake, Adam Curtis's authorial personality, his sensibility, is strongly on display. Describe some of the ways that Curtis is present in his found footage film. And finally, on many occasions, Adam Curtis has described himself as a journalist. The director of The Act of Killing, on the other hand, Joshua Oppenheimer, sees himself more in terms of an artist. Now, both of these filmmakers, these contemporary filmmakers, are considered documentarians, perhaps despite their own arguments to the contrary. What are some of the key differences in approaching hidden realities between Adam Curtis and Joshua Oppenheimer? And despite their differences, in what ways do you think they might be similar? So I look forward to taking up some of these questions and your own thoughts and comments on all of the topics and issues that came up in this week tomorrow and on Canvas. Thanks very much.